Um, so our final targeted collaborative debate is going to deal with the in-situ theory of ellipses. The question that James Griffiths and Volker Struckmeier are going to ask is, what does a plausible in-situ theory of ellipses look like? James is going to defend the syntactic question approach, and Volker is going to defend the hybrid forms and meanings approach. So James and Volker, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanya. I'll begin. Before I present my own approach, Volker and I would just like to provide a little bit of context on the debate. So the debate will focus exclusively on fragmentary utterances, clausal ellipsis. So apologies to those scholars of pseudo-gapping out there. Of course, the question of how extendable our approach is an important one, and perhaps we can discuss this during the question and answer session. So within this more restricted debating arena, the prevailing view in the minimalist literature is that, well, it has 2 points to it. That standard fragmentary utterances are elliptic clauses, and that ellipsis is non-pronunciation. We can call this the silent structure analysis. And secondly, that ellipsis is unselective. In other words, it applies to a phrase and deletes the entirety of that phrase, and therefore to avoid ellipsis, a remnant that would otherwise be contained in that phrase must move above the ellipsis site. Now, those approaches that adopt two in addition to one, we're going to call those move and delete approaches, or MDAs. Now, there's good motivation for suggesting that this movement occurs, and that's that ellipsis remnants show hallmarks of A-bar movement, even if they wouldn't usually undergo movement in a non-elliptic environment. A number of these hallmarks have been noted in the literature. I'm just going to remind you of two here. One of which is the p-stranding generalization, which holds with fragments as well. So this generalization says that if you have a fragment which is interpreted as the complement of a preposition, it will be degraded or unacceptable in this language that doesn't allow p-stranding in normal WH movement environment. So German would be an example. I have a dialogue here. Haben Sie mit dem Mann gesprochen? Now you can do the PP answer, nein, mit der Frau, but nein, der Frau, the DP version is judged as degraded. And on the MDA approach, this would be because the elliptic clause would look something like the final schema that you see here, where you'd be doing p-stranding movement out of the ellipsis site. Another hallmark is island sensitivity, at least when island evasion is unavailable. I'm afraid I don't have time to explain what that means. I hope most people know. You can see this in the dialogues here. So they examined a well-prepared student. Yes, very well, doesn't work. The fact that a Labour MP threatened John is comical and conservative too doesn't work. And this would be understood as being bad because you would have island violating movement inside the elliptic clause, as is shown at the bottom of the slide here. Now, the approaches that Volker and I are pursuing are in situ silent structure analysis. So they retain the silent structure analysis, but they say the following: postulating ellipsis-driven movement yields incorrect predictions and/or requires implausible recourse to ellipsis repair. The problems of the MDA are avoided by permitting ellipsis to occur around designated constituents. So in other words, we allow remnants to move out of ellipsis sites if they would move anyway, but we also allow the possibility of remnants staying in situ with ellipsis happening around them. So we believe that a good in situ theory of ellipsis must explain why remnants of ellipsis show A-bar properties, or show that these A-bar properties actually don't exist at all. Volker will talk about that. And they should, of course, confer greater descriptive and explanatory adequacy more generally to be favoured over move and delete approaches. So with that in mind, that's the context. I'm now going to turn to my theory of ellipsis, the in situ one, which I call the syntactic question approach. And I've been pursuing this in recent research by myself and also with my colleagues, Gulis Gunesh and Eniko Liptak. So my presentation will have 4 parts. First, I'm going to present 3 facts about clausal ellipsis that motivate my approach, and I believe any theory of clausal ellipsis should try and handle. I'll call these basic facts. Then I'll give you the defining characteristics of my approach. I'll show how it explains the A-bar properties of fragments that we've just seen. And then I'm going to list some what I consider to be unique advantages of the approach that no other approach currently has. Okay, so let's begin. So basic facts, I'm going to present 3 of them. The first one, which I take to be a fact, is that identity for ellipsis should be stated over structured meanings. By this I mean syntactic phrase markers, LFs, or structured propositions in the German tradition, whichever floats your boat. I actually would go with LFs. But this is in contrast to unstructured meanings, so just a propositional meaning not derived by a linguistic object. And I think this is a fact for 2 reasons. Firstly, there are various phenomena out there that are only adequately explained if the identity condition is stated over a structured meaning. I've listed a whole bunch here that I won't go through. You can look through these at your leisure. And secondly, if you look to the psycholinguistic literature, the results of these studies seem to favor an identity condition stated over structured meanings. So I'm thinking here of work by Lynn Fraser and Charles Clifton and their colleagues, who over the years have argued that structural matching is required between an ellipsis clause and its antecedent. They give this various names. And when you see mismatches, these are repaired by the processor, and importantly, that structural information allowing for ellipsis licensing decays quickly. This effectively counts for why antecedents must be discourse proximate. If they're too far away, you've forgotten the structure that would be with them otherwise. Okay, so that's the first basic fact. The second has to do with deaccentuation. It's well known that deaccented clauses are licensed in a number of cases where elliptic clauses aren't. Now, just a word about what I mean by deaccented clauses. I'm not making any suggestions about prosody here, except all I want to say is that by deaccenting is when a clause in which deaccenting would be licensed. So you have a narrow focus and the rest of the clause would be given in a pre-theoretical sense. And you could do deaccenting prosodically in these cases. Okay, so just to show you the difference here, if we look at a dialogue like 1, this is a classic voice alternation case where if you have an active antecedent, someone has eaten my sandwich, you can't use a passive elliptic clause. Yeah, by Bill, it doesn't work. But the deaccented version works okay. Yeah, your sandwich was eaten by Bill. We still have the focus on Bill here. Another nice case that I've taken from Andrew Weir's work and modified slightly is given in 2. Who ate the cake? Now you can't answer with, well, Bill, to mean, well, Bill has been looking guilty lately. But with that deaccentuated pattern seems to work okay. And it seems in that case, you're kind of inferring that looking guilty is something to do with eating the cake, right? So you're accommodating some strategy there. Okay, and the third fact I'd like to bring to the fore here is the sensitivity of fragments to the pragmatic status of questions. I'm going to try and convince you of this by 2 data points, one of which comes from Andrew Weir. This is the first one. So he notes that explicitly uttered antecedents, if they're a question, a WH question, an assertoric fragment must answer that question. So just to see this, let's have a look at 3. Here the antecedent is a WH question with an embedded clause in it. Who did Mary say has the key to the liquor cabinet? Now you can do clausal ellipsis, you can use the entire question to license clausal ellipsis. So if you say Frank, it means she said that Frank has the key to the liquor cabinet. If you try and use the embedded CP, you can't license clausal ellipsis. Frank, but I don't know what Mary said. It doesn't work. Interestingly, you can use that embedded clause to license VP ellipsis. Frank has, but I don't know what Mary says. That's no problem, okay? So clausal ellipsis is sensitive more than VP ellipsis is in this case. The other data point I'd like to make you aware of here comes from my own work, where I noted that answered, or let's say dismissively answered questions can't serve as antecedents for ellipsis, despite being discourse proximate to them. Let's have a look at a dialogue. Where did she go? I don't know, but I think with Tim. Oh, it doesn't work. Or what will she sing? Well, whatever it is, twice. This doesn't work either. And I think this is because you're answering the questions before then trying to use that answered question to license ellipsis, showing that once you've answered it, you can no longer use it. Okay, so there's a sensitivity here. These are the 3 basic facts. I'd like to now move on to try and build an analysis on that explains these facts. We'll eventually get to my approach. So what about the identity condition being stated over structure? Well, fortunately for me, there's been a lot of work on this recently, especially coming out of the Santa Cruz, from the Santa Cruz group. They've been looking at mismatches, and I'm just taking here a syntactic condition on plausible ellipsis. I'm approximating it from recent work by them. So they say something like, well, let XP be the argument domain of some elliptic, or in my case as well, the accented clause CP. You can do ellipsis in this clause if the heads and the relations there between in this XP are equal to or are a subset of the heads and the relations there between in some discourse salient YP. In other words, the argument domain of the antecedent. Now, discourse salient here, I'm taking this to mean something like contained in an at-issue discourse unit. Folliker will say much more on exactly what this means in his presentation. I'm adopting this condition just for the sake of concreteness here, and also because it accounts quite nicely for the observation that mismatches are permitted above but not below the argument domain in an antecedent elliptic clause pair. See the work of Anandatal and Rudin for more on that. What about the deaccentuation case? Well, this is classically accounted for by employing the notion of antecedent accommodation. I'm going to take a Foxian view here. So antecedent accommodation is triggered whenever the isomorphism condition that you just saw is not met. And accommodated implicit antecedents are then used to try and meet this condition. These accommodated antecedents themselves are structured meanings, so they're linguistic objects. This is what Fox says, and I will follow this. And I'll also follow Fox in assuming that linguistic material in the proximate discourse informs the possibilities that we have for antecedent accommodation. Now, trying to dovetail with the isomorphism condition that we just had, I've put forward a concrete restriction on antecedent accommodation here, which effectively says, when you build the argument domain of your accommodated antecedent, if you need one, it must be syntactically constructed using the non-elliptic linguistic material in the discourse context, okay? So that's how you can restrict things in terms of argument domain in the same way that fits the isomorphism condition. Let me just show you how this works. So take that voice alternation case. Here we have the passive active mismatch here. Now the isomorphism condition isn't satisfied here between A and B, so you need to do antecedent accommodation. You can use any of this material, so let's use the stuff in green, and we can build ourselves your sandwich was eaten by somebody, a passive sentence which can be used to license the accentuation in 9b. Why does the ellipsis case fail? Well, there's less material available to us to do accommodation from. We only have the stuff in green here, and from this we can't build a passive antecedent. In fact, all we can really do is build the active case again. And here, obviously, the isomorphism condition isn't going to be satisfied by either the antecedent, the explicitly uttered antecedent, or the implicit one. So ellipsis fails because it has no licenser. Okay, now I'm still not at my approach yet. I think that the clausal ellipsis, any analysis of clausal ellipsis should adopt both of these two things. The next slide is my innovation. So this is where we get to the syntactic question approach. To account for that third fact that we saw about the sensitivity to questions, I'm going to propose that elliptic clauses can only be licensed by questions. That's the constraint that I'm adding here. This means that if your explicit antecedent is not a question, you have to do antecedent accommodation, yielding an implicit WH question. Because I'm pursuing an in-situ theory, I'm going to say that ellipsis occurs around designated subclausal phrases, so I don't have ellipsis-driven movement. Okay, it's an in-situ approach. Let me just very roughly show you how this all works. So take a dialogue like 11. Here we have an assertion, a declarative assertion as the antecedent here. Now, according to me, this is not good as an antecedent. We have to do accommodation of a question here. How does that work? Well, very roughly speaking, it's got two steps to it. Take the fragment, the remnant of ellipsis, convert it to a WH phrase of the same type. So we've got a DP and a human here, so we get who or which person. Then do antecedent accommodation in the same way that you saw previously. I'm going to take the stuff in green in 11a here, and I can build who has eaten the cake as the antecedent. That will be used to then license ellipsis in 11b. This is very rough. Please see the papers here for the technical details. Now I'm going to account for the A-bar properties that we saw. So recall I've just said if the antecedent is, the explicit antecedent is an assertion or declarative, both, then ellipsis is licensed by a WH question. And because this implicit antecedent question is a linguistic object, it must obey the WH question formation rules in any given language, right? So the upshot of this is that you can account for the A-bar properties of fragments without using ellipsis-driven movement. It's actually the movement requirements on the accommodated question which is giving the illusion of there being movement inside the elliptical clause. That's the idea. So it gives us the correct predictions that we want for WH movement languages, as I'm now going to show you. So it's well known that remnants of ellipsis must correspond to WH movable items. This is the major constituent constraint. I'll show it you here in the dialogue in 12. Susie just met with someone important. Now you can't answer this with, yeah, met with Joe Biden. It doesn't work. It sounds really odd. With Joe Biden is fine. Joe Biden is fine, but not met with Joe Biden. Now, why? Well, according to me, you would have to take that VP, convert it into a WH phrase, and then build a question from it. And you just can't do that and make a good implicit WH question that could license 12b. 12b goes unlicensed, and that's why ellipsis is judged as bad here. Same would hold for the P-stranding generalization. Let's go back to German. Anna hat mit jemandem gesprochen. You try and say, ja, dem Hans. Now here you take dem Hans, convert it into wem, DP, WH phrase, try and build a question from that. The best you can do is a P-stranding question, which is ungrammatical. So no license for 13b either. Island sensitivity, same situation. The best hiding place is under the bed. No, the car. Why doesn't it work? Try and build an implicit question that could license this. You'll build a question that, at least with this interpretation, is not a good question. So no licenser again. And this would work for any, well, I hope, for any A-bar property that you can think of. Now I'm going to move on to show you some unique advantages of this approach. So we've been talking about fragments with A-bar properties. Neglected is the fact that there are fragments out there without A-bar properties. So recall, my approach is saying that the A-bar properties of fragments are reflexes of licensing ellipsis from a WH question antecedent, whether this is explicit or implicit. Okay, so the prediction here is if you've already got an explicitly uttered antecedent, which is not a WH question, fragments should not show A-bar properties, right? I've done a slight bit of research into this with alternative question antecedents in WH movement languages, and this seems to be borne out. Let me show you. So, for example, remnants of ellipsis can correspond to WH immovable items if the antecedent is an alternative question. Is in or under the bed the best hiding place? Under, I reckon. Perfectly fine, even though the preposition is not WH immovable. I just note a case I found from a Zwicky paper, a very old one, who noted the same thing years ago. Are you traveling to or from Africa? To. Now, it's not just prepositions that work like this. You can do this with transitive verbs. You can even do it with some morphemes as well. You can license those as fragments if you have an alternative question. Going to the P-stranding generalization, the handful of Germans that I've asked have told me that when you have an alternative question as a antecedent, then you have a much better P-stranding style fragment than you would with any other antecedent type. So, hat Anna mit dem Mädchen oder dem Jungen gesprochen? Dem Mädchen is much better than the other cases. And for the Dutch people I've asked, the same applies. The conclusion to draw here is that the syntactic question approach is fine-grained enough to correctly predict the antecedent type, whether it's declarative, a WH question, an alternative question, or echo questions as well. And if you're interested in that, please see the research listed below. This will affect the behavior of fragments. The move and delete approach, as far as I can tell, can't account for that at all. They haven't tried, but I can't account for it either. Another unique selling point here is to do with WH in-situ languages. So it's a known fact that there are fewer obvious constraints on WH question formation in WH in-situ languages than in WH movement languages. There's a prediction that falls out of this for my approach, which is that fragments in-situ languages are less sensitive to islands than their counterparts in WH movement languages. And at least from what I've looked at, this seems to be borne out. So let's have a look at a Turkish case that shows this. Here is a dialogue from Turkish where person A says Hassan spoke with a child that walked a cat. Now, cat here is going to be the correlate to the fragment. It's contained in what might be called an island in WH movement language. Now, you can respond to this by saying, no, a dog, higher, kapia. Now, this is fine, right? Now, you might think, this is okay because there's a short source available here, but actually there isn't. 19 shows that there's no short source. So this is genuinely island insensitive. Now, why is this good? Well, I think it's because the question that you would have to accommodate to license the fragment is generatable in Turkish. It's the one given in the box here. It's absolutely fine. Now, the prediction still arises that you would see island sensitivity, but only when a WH question, an implicit antecedent WH question, is unavailable. So I've tested this as well. So if you take another Turkish case like this in 28, Ali is angry at the man that Aisha invited for a particular reason. Here, again, a correlate inside an island. Now, the fragmentary response here, yes, out of obligation, is judged to be bad. Why? Well, when you try and license this from an implicit WH question, you can't make the question. It's one of these famous WH adverbial questions inside an island, which aren't good in these types of WH in-situ languages. Now, I've dug around a little bit in the literature and found that the same pattern is noted for Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese. Genuine island insensitivity most of the time, except in these particular cases, which is encouraging for my account. Finally, my account, and indeed any in-situ account, can account for why the linear order of fragments is correctly and straightforwardly conserved with multiple fragment cases. Let me give you a nice example here from English 21. Bob's writing awful love songs again. Oh no, not again. Why? And who even for? Who even for? Okay, swiping with a modal particle in between. Now, you try and derive this using the move and delete approach, and you run into problems. You require tucking in, and you require moving an unmovable modal particle, whereas on the in-situ approach, it falls out naturally. That's what I wanted to show you. Here's a summary. Ellipsis licensing makes reference to structured meanings. Antecedent accommodation is real, and accommodating antecedents are syntactically well formed, and an elliptic clause must be licensed by a discourse proximate and answered question. This accounts for the basic facts that I showed you at the start. I can explain better than other approaches to things that I showed you at the end. Now, to link this to Volker's upcoming presentation, you'll see that his proposal is similar to mine in a number of ways, but he shuns the idea that clausal ellipsis is licensed by a syntactically derived question. I believe that because of this, his approach can't explain a number of things that I've listed here. Just to pick one or two out, why island insensitivity is observed in dialogues where all the material is at issue. Something like John is a bad worker, no hard. This can only mean that he's tough. Actually, that should be a pound sign. And Volker will deny that the p-stranding generalization even holds, because that's something that his approach wouldn't account for. So I'm going to stop there and give Volker the floor. Thank you very much for listening to my part of the presentation.
Thanks. Now I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see this? Right. So as James said, I subscribe to most of the things he says. And since we've started discussing this talk, I agree with even more things that he said. And maybe this isn't also surprising because a couple of years ago, Dennis Ott and myself had a proposal that was very much in the spirit of James' proposal as well. But we noticed some sort of glitches with the proposal. And since then, just because I knew that I would one day want to spite James, I collected those issues. And I'd like to mostly present those issues here rather than present a very well-developed theory. So my theory is less predictive than James, but I think that's a good thing. recall that James said that if something is stuck in an island, then it can't be very well used as an elliptical fragment. And the case was something like, a case from the literature, would John hire somebody who tries to fix a car with a hammer? If you then say no, a screwdriver, then that cannot be taken to mean, no, John would hire somebody who tries to fix a car with a screwdriver. And this has been taken to mean that materials from relative clauses, because they're islands, is unavailable for elliptical reconstruction. And I agree that in this case, it is unavailable for elliptical reconstruction. But what these cases don't show is that this is always and generally the case. So I would like to point out that the question of whether you reconstruct the relative clause or not has nothing whatsoever to do with syntax, specifically not with extractability. Rather, it's all discourse. So here's something that my little 4-year-old daughter might say. When she's watched a story, a cartoon, or read a book or something, then she comes and recalls the story, but in a slightly incoherent manner. So she could come running and say, Daddy, I saw a cartoon about a zoo. There was a giraffe and an elephant, and Pedro tried to catch a rabbit. And now you don't know who Pedro is, right? Because she didn't properly introduce the referent. So you say, hä? Is Pedro ein Pflanzenfresser, der Tiere jagt? Is Pedro a herbivore that chases animals? And now she could say, nein, Zoowärter. Zoowärter means zookeeper or zookeepers. It's a syncretism. You don't know whether this is singular or plural. And now suddenly this can mean, no, Pedro is a zookeeper, or Pedro chases zookeepers. So you could reconstruct the main clause. Thank you for 50 minutes. You can reconstruct the main clause, which is always blue, or you could reconstruct the relative clause, which is always green, and it's completely ambiguous here, probably because the whole discourse was a bit underdetermined, let's say. She's only 4. I'm going to skip over this slide. Of course, you cannot extract, just like James said, you cannot say, Zoowärter ist Pedro ein Pflanzenfresser, der jagt. You cannot say, was ist Pedro ein Pflanzenfresser, der jagt. So the syntactic restriction would say that this was not an ellipsis option to reconstruct the relative clause, but it is. Now, the following examples, it was pointed out to us by a reviewer, might be considered offensive by some viewers, so buckle up. So A comes in and says, I met Adrian in the US who drives a truck and wears a baseball cap and loves burgers and is so all-American. And now B says, oh no, let me guess. Adrian is a guy who always has a gun with him. And A says, no, a woman. Think about what that means. If the people I asked who are English native speakers tells me it means this. No, he always has a woman with him. This is at least the most salient reading. All the people I asked for the corresponding German sentences also went for the relative clause reconstruction, contrary to the expectations that might be raised by the SQA. Now, of course, we don't want to equate women with guns or with properties. The reading didn't even occur to us, but still, apologies. We didn't want to sweep it under the rug because it was in the abstract and we wanted to clear this up. It's interesting, though, to see why this reading is so salient and why the alternative reading is almost off limits. So I met Adrian in the US, and now maybe there's an expectation that more boys than girls are called Adrian. I don't know about that. I haven't checked it, but maybe that's true. Adding stereotypes as the materials in red, drives a truck, eats burgers, might not help with the impression that Adrian could be a male. So now if B comes in and says, Adrian is a guy who, blah, 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 this is quasi-tautological. Adrian, who you have already decided is a male who, blah, blah, blah. So the main clause is entirely uninformative. The only thing that is informative here is the relative clause, and it includes a gun, which is very spectacular. So what you want to do desperately is to reconstruct the relative clause and say, no, he always has a woman with him. Note, however, that the reconstruction in the main clause would be, no, Adrian is a woman, which would be very informative in this context. It would be very coherent as well to settle this and fix the mistake that has been made. But still, the reading is unavailable, it seems. And now you'll say, well, this depends on Adrian being a funny name. Okay, witness the continuous relative clause case as in 4. John gave the news to Jim, who then passed it on to Claire, and B says no to Sue. This can only mean that Jim passed the news on to Sue. It cannot refer back, like James said, to propositions and say, well, John gave the news to Sue. But this means that you have to reconstruct the relative clause again. Now you're going to say, well, this is a continuative relative clause. Maybe those are different from the other ones. Here's a non-continuative relative clause. So in the German Democratic Republic, they had cars whose bodies were made from carbon. And now B says no cardboard. This can only mean the bodies were made from cardboard. It cannot mean they had cardboard in the GDR. We're going to get to explanations of this. I'm just sort of trying to show to you that no matter how you cut it, relative clauses are generally available. So the island bit of the SQA does no actual work, and I consider it to be a bit superfluous. So relative clauses are sometimes available and sometimes unavailable. The thing that you don't want to do is to make multiple analyses of relative clauses, some of which are extraction transparent, because this would be stipulative in the extreme. If you want to talk about it, I'm happy to, but I'd rather skip the slide here because it's just too horrible to contemplate. So this is my proposal. And the first thing I want to say is it overgenerates. It's very rough around the edges. It's a fledgling theory. It's not designed to explain anything, everything, no, anyway, not everything. So it has a discourse part and it has a syntactic part, and the two have not very much to do with each other. So it's a hybrid theory in the sense that it has two parts. And if you want to talk about that in the Q&A, I think that's a good thing. I think that's desirable. Okay, so the proposal in a nutshell, in a very non-technical rendition is this. Only the last at issue proposition ever reconstructs in a discourse. So if you want to reconstruct something because your utterance is elliptical, what you want to reconstruct is the last at issue proposition. We're going to talk about what that means. This is the discourse bit in very simple terms. The syntactic bit is this. Remnant materials, and James said something very different, something very similar. Remnant materials are licensed only by lexical items that had been used verbatim in that last at issue proposition. And these two things together, I think, make the bulk of the predictions, and they avoid the undergeneration of ellipsis options that I think the SQA causes. Going back to the cars and hammers example, would John hire somebody who tries to fix a car with a hammer? B comes in and says no, and now we pause the movie and we ask ourselves, what has B just rejected? And of course, B has rejected that John would hire such a person, where such a stands for the properties of the relative clause. Now, what this does not mean is there is no X such that X would try to fix a car with a hammer, i.e. nobody fixes cars with hammers. That's not what the negation means. So you have rejected the main clause, and now you're offering a contrast, which of course you have to construe into the main clause that you have just rejected. So what you get is, would John hire somebody who tries to fix a car with a hammer? No, a screwdriver can only mean, no, John would hire a screwdriver, which is an available reading, even though it has certain problems of its own regarding employability. The continuative relative clauses are easy to explain. John passed the news to Jim, who then passed it on to Claire. Well, the continuative is a discourse move in its own right. It introduces its own proposition. It proffers it for inclusion in the common ground, so you can reconstruct it. And since it's the last proposition, you must reconstruct it. And that's all there is to this case. In the GDR, they had cars whose bodies were made from carbon, no cardboard. If you believe that a heavily industrialized Central European country like the GDR, that it's informative to say they had cardboard there, well, maybe not. Also, cardboard is just not a very good alternative to cars. So this would be a weird contrast even in a non-elliptical case. So you want to reconstruct the relative clause because that's the only coherent and informative continuation that you can get. Now, for historical accuracy, the Trabant 601 automobile was indeed produced. It was affectionately called the racing cardboard, Rennpappe, but it was not made from cardboard. This was not a commercial break because I don't endorse the use of that vehicle. Back to linguistics. The common ground from which you reconstruct the last proposition contains propositions. It doesn't contain extra propositional materials. And in a paper by Dennis Ott and myself, we pointed out that modal particles in German are anathema to the MDA in that they are included in fragments regularly, despite the fact that they cannot be focused and they cannot be moved. So they're exactly the opposite of what the MDA predicts. But I believe that they're equally bad, in fact, for the SQA, because so in 6A, who does Peter like, seine Freunde wohl, this is mainly an MDA problem. But in 6b, Peter likes somebody, wen denn means something like, so who does he like? Here you have a question that you couldn't answer overtly. So this should be something that should be restricted, but it's not. It's perfectly fine. And in my theory, it just follows from the fact that MPs, modal particles, are very peculiar elements that don't contribute to truth functional propositions that could ever be entered into the common ground. Now, of course, the syntactic theory could state, and I think James' theory does state that in some cases, you just waive the island restriction and you say, well, you zoom in on the relative clause proposition, you form a question over that, and then you're out of the island. Right, that's fine. And I endorse that, because if only James did this all the time to waive the island restriction, waive the movement restriction, he would arrive at my theory, which is all that I want. As for the other SQA predictions, I'm trying to be fast. I say, even if the SQA got other things right, this may not be good enough, because if it undergenerates ellipsis, then shouldn't we reject it just like the MDA? And also, I want to point out that the empirical record for the other predictions is a bit of a mixed bag here. P-stranding. It's well known that German doesn't allow P-stranding. That's true. What is less well known is that the elliptical cases don't mirror that. So, für wen arbeitet Peter, den Papst, is fine by many speakers. It's fine by me. Despite the fact that this should be based on the P-stranding structure in 8, den Papst arbeitet Peter für, according to the MDA, or it should have been, it should have used the SQA violating question, wen arbeitet Peter für? And despite that, the answer is fine. Now, for the longest time, I've been running around and telling people that, and nobody believed me because it was only me, and maybe I'm crazy. But thankfully, Robin Lemke has completed a dissertation where he tested this, and the following are his empirical results. Some speakers reject, or let's say they disprefer the P-less remnant to the remnant with the DP. But the DP-less version is significantly better than negative controls, and it is also significantly better than the cases in 8 and 9 that allegedly underlie it. So it's much, much better than what the MDA and the SQA would predict. I'm going to skip this slide. It's the P-stranding effects that you see seem to have to do with morphophonology. The weirder the case marking is, the worse the P-less remnant becomes. But for nominatives and accusatives, no issues arise. And for datives, some issues arise, but not nearly enough to warrant the SQA. And it's only for genitive DPs that you get the restrictions, but alternative explanations are available that don't require movement. I'm going to skip this. The assumption that P-stranding in English waives all sorts of restrictions on ellipsis formation is wrong as well. And I'm going to refer you to the appendix for the following statement. Extractions from subclauses in German other than relative clauses don't mirror ellipsis options. Extractions from noun complements, DP left branches, do not really mirror ellipsis options either. Real-life discourse data often requires the use of QUDs that are not exactly in conformity with the SQA. You can read that up with Andrista and colleagues' work. And also, when there are restrictions that seem to be mirrored, what the empirical image is that the ellipsis option is slightly dispreferred. It's a bit hard to get. It's not perfect, but the structure allegedly underlying it is horrible. So I don't take that to be a mirror image. Those are just two very, very different reactions of speakers to allegedly identical structures. So I say that we give up on that mirror image theory because it's not a mirror image. Now, there's certain things that you can't do with discourse, and James thankfully already said that you have to have verbatim licensors. Now, I'm going to move quick because I'm running late. I'm going to follow many people, for instance, Chung and Gonzalez and Ramos, who have shown that you must assume that the remnant is licensed by lexical items that had been used verbatim in the last utterance. I'm going to agree with that. Here's one case that's really nice. Many German verbs license lexical case, and some of them have multiple case frames. So the verb to freeze, to be cold, it actually means, has two case frames. You can use it with an experiencer accusative or an experiencer nominative. Now, if you ask the question in 14, you ask for an accusative, then you have to answer with an accusative, but only if the answer is elliptical. If you ask for a nominative, as in 15, you have to answer with a nominative, but only if the answer is elliptical. So this is not at all about question-answer congruence. This is about the licensing of that pronoun in the answer. And you have to reconstruct verbatim the licensing frame from the question. So this is clearly not discourse. This is clearly syntax, but note, it has nothing whatsoever to do with movement. Trivially, you can contrast things that are way back in the discourse, but not if you do it elliptically. Now, if you put these two things together, you get a very nice prediction, which is, why can you only anaphorically link back with ellipsis to the last utterance, basically? Well, because you've forgotten the licensor in every other case. So the original form of a sentence is only stored for the short time necessary for comprehension to occur, 1967. And this has been replicated over and over and over again. So there is nothing, in fact, in the competence grammar that permits, or that I should say, that prohibits ellipsis to go back further, except that your hearers will not be able to understand what you mean. They've forgotten the antecedent. Now, if I may, asking the chair here, I could say a few words about language acquisition. Is that a yes or a no?
1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, fine. The MDA, as well as the SQA, ask us to believe that there is invisible movements either in the fragment or in the QD, something that children cannot observe. They also tell us that this is language specific. But if it's language specific, it cannot be a universal, so not known by some principle. It must be something that's where there's parameters to set. But if the observable movements differ in any way from the unobservable movements, then the child will not be able to set the parameters on the unobservable movements, because they're unobservable and they're different from what the child can actually observe. To the degree then that the unobservable movements are different, these theories are unlearnable, I claim. My theory faces no such issues because there isn't much going on in terms of invisible movements and such, and I'll leave this for the Q&A. My theory, on the other hand, is very simple in that it conforms to expectations of even the most basic assumptions. So why would you want to elide recoverable materials? Well, you want to maximize the channel capacity, but for people who are sadly without any psychic powers. So why do you reconstruct propositions and not motor particles, say? Well, because the only thing that your interlocutors, I'm almost finished. The only thing that your interlocutors will be able to remember are what they can recover from the common ground. MPs are not in it. Why do you want to reconstruct the at issue proposition? Because that's what you're currently talking about. Why do you want to recover the last at issue proposition? Because your hearers will not remember anything else regarding the formal licensing of the fragment. So here's our summary. Like James said, we both assume deletion is in situ. We both assume that there's a lot of structure in the ellipsis side. We both assume that there's QDs and they're important for coherence and for reconstruction and for very many things. But we disagree, and this we have spoken about at length, whether the QD should be syntactically derivable or not. And something that has been sort of on the sidelines, been floating a bit in the background, is that I am not so sure how much actual syntax is in the ellipsis side, whereas James would have to assume that anything, at least that relates to question formation, is in fact in the underlying structure as well. I would like to remind you that there's an appendix regarding the examples that I had to skip, but for now, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James and Volker. We have 16 minutes for questions, so please write them in the chat with an indication of whether you are a senior or junior in the field. And just to get things going, let me start by asking a question. James, my question is for you. When I saw your example of the island-sensitive fragment answers, so it's example 14 on slide 25. Well, this is a contrastive fragment answer, right? And as you know, because you wrote a paper on this, there's a famous distinction between contrastive and non-contrastive fragment answers. And I was wondering whether this observation also follows from your current account, whether it's maybe in some way compatible with the account you had in the paper with Anniko. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, well spotted. So I have to say something. So just so everybody knows in the audience, in a paper with Anniko, we discussed the difference that was pointed out before us. I think that there is a difference in non-contrastive versus contrastive fragments regarding island sensitivity. My current approach accounts for this in the same. I basically take an approach from Matthew Barros's work, I think a 2013 paper of his. So what I effectively say is that when you're making a contrast, there is an additional pragmatic constraint at work, which is saying when you make a contrast, you're making a contrast between the entirety, if you like, or more of, or yeah, let's go for the entirety. That makes it simpler, of the previous antecedent. Okay, so when you accommodate a question, you're going to have to accommodate a question which is effectively has the antecedent as an answer. Whereas when you have a non-contrastive antecedent, that pragmatic constraint does not apply. So you could effectively construct an accommodated question from just bits of the antecedent, namely you can make a short source. But because of this additional pragmatic constraint, you have to construct a sentence which is bigger and likely to include the island. And therefore, because you can't make that question, because it would involve doing island violating WH movement, the accommodated question is unavailable to you. And that's how you get the island sensitivity. So that's how I encode it this time. It's no longer is it about moving contrastive phrases out of islands in the same way. But yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you.
That makes sense.
Yes. Let me now give the floor to a question by Louise Schwarzer.
Hi,
Louise.
yes. So this is a question for James, and I have to admit I'm not super familiar with your previous papers, but I didn't quite understand how your approach forces in situ ellipsis, or how it's actually, what is in situ about it? Because as I understood, you have to put the fragment into a movement dependency to license it. So could you explain that again?
Yeah, I can explain it again. Yeah, I don't know whether bringing my slides up is. I don't think I need them. So it's not putting them into a movement dependency. The idea here is that in the elliptic clause, if you have a remnant of ellipsis, something that survives ellipsis that wouldn't normally move, let's just say it's a DP, which is presentationally focused in English, it's not going to move. It doesn't move in that elliptic clause at all. If it's showing A bar properties, it's because trying to derive an antecedent for it, where let's say you're trying to accommodate an antecedent, I'm saying that antecedent typically has to be a WH question, and you have to do WH movement to derive that question. And so if you're unable to derive that accommodated question, it can't be a licenser. It's unavailable as a licenser. Without any other licensors available or any other possibilities to accommodate, there's nothing available to license ellipsis. So there's nothing wrong with the elliptic clause. That's fine. That's generated normally. The problem is you can't generate an antecedent to license the ellipsis.
Right.
So
that's the difference. Yeah. So you have movement in the realm of antecedents, and I was wondering if that is actually compatible with the MDA, or.
What I'm effectively doing is I'm replicating the MDA at a different level. So I'm taking it out of the ellipsis, the elliptic clause, and putting it into the antecedent. Now you might think that just gives you absolutely everything the same, but it doesn't. It allows you to have remnants of ellipsis that shouldn't undergo focus movement, not to undergo focus movement. It allows you to keep fragments, multiple fragments in the order that you'd expect them, rather than to have some crazy tucking in thing. Blah blah blah. So there are advantages to it. So I'm having my cake and eating it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I may chime in questions, what James is pointing out, that in questions, the movement properties are independent of ellipsis, because that's what questions in WH ex situ languages do anyway. So there's no dedicated elliptical movement that would ever differ, hopefully, for the SQA from observable movements, right? Unlike in the MDA, where you move stuff that is in principle movable, but would never move in an overt non-elliptical utterance.
So James, you just said something that made me wonder. You said that it follows from your account that you have these particles, like in Volker's work, appearing in appearing in fragments, for instance, or in clausal ellipses. But as Volker pointed out, it was also one of my questions. How do you actually deal with these particles appearing in fragments or in clausal ellipses in your account?
Yeah. So I guess there's two elements to accounting for this. Firstly, like what's the licensing of these fragments? And then the second one is like actually the notion of ellipsis itself. Like how does ellipsis ignore them, if you like? So with the first case, in terms of licensing, I just don't think this is part of the licensing at all. So it's just totally beyond it. It's on a different level of meaning. If you want to use as a speaker one of these modal particles, you can. It's not part of the QUD or anything like that, or the accommodated antecedent. And it doesn't need to be, because after all, you're going to say it, right? So it doesn't have to be given. It doesn't have to be elided in any way. In terms of saving it from ellipsis, yeah, you have to define the actual process of ellipsis in a particular way, such that it doesn't look at them. So in my 2019 paper, I just have to stipulate this. I have to say focused elements can stay, and also modal particles can stay as well. So yeah, that is a stipulation.
Okay, Mitcho has several questions.
I'll try to keep it short, but thank you. So I took away that for both of your approaches, questions are central. And so I want to understand a little bit better in what sense questions are central. So I have a question for each. For Volker, this is, I think, just a clarification question. Are questions special in the sense that you are talking a lot about what is at issue as the antecedent, and you're subscribing to the sort of Roberts-Simons et al. View about at issue necessarily being congruent to a question under discussion? And then for James, I had a different question, which is, is it really this, because you're also emphasizing the syntax. I wonder about structures that syntactically look like questions, but maybe are not used as questions. For example, maybe free relatives, unconditionals, things like that. Do those also similarly, under your theory, would you predict that those have this privileged status of licensing causal ellipsis as well? Or is it really something about the pragmatic use of questions as well that you need under your view? So those are the questions about questions.
Should I start? James, you want to go
Please.
first?
No, you can go on.
So yeah, I'm not proposing any special theory. So if you pose a question explicitly, then of course you've raised an issue, and this must be addressed if there isn't anything that sort of overrides that requirement, like the building is on fire or something, then interlocutors should address the question. Also, the question is not random, not in James' approach and not in mine, so you can't skip around and asking like weird questions all the time, but there's some sort of answering strategy. You're cutting up bigger questions into sub-questions, which you then can answer a sentence at a time. And there's very many ways that you can predict what likely questions are going to be. So if there was some case where I just saw somebody, well, somebody is an indefinite, that raises the question, who was it, right? And so a good next sentence, whether that question is asked or not, a good next sentence was, I saw somebody, it was, I don't know, James. Yeah? And likewise, there's various mechanisms in antecedent utterances that raise questions into the discourse that make it likely that the question will be answered in the subsequent step. So I subscribe to that fully, and there's nothing unorthodox about my theory here. What I'm What I'm arguing against is that the question is anything other than a semantic object of some sorts, an imaginable issue that you want to address. Whether or not you can formulate that in your specific language or languages is, to me, almost immaterial. I'm saying almost because if you're completely unused to asking a certain type of question, then it might be difficult for you to do. After all, we're creatures of habit, right? So there might be a performance relation between what you can ask in a language and what sort of comes naturally to you. But I'd assume it's a softer type of preference, likelihood connection, rather than saying if you couldn't derive it syntactically, then it cannot be the next question in the discourse.
And yeah, with regards to, sorry, yeah. Well, do we want to follow up on that, or shall I? Okay.
No, I understand it better. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, your question's a really good one regarding question-like things. I think obviously you get a more restrictive theory if you limit things to actually questions that have interrogative structures that have question force, like eretetic speech acts. And with regards to things like free relatives, and I'm not sure about whether you'd be able to tell the difference, because I could always say, if you give me a free relative, well, I'm going to use that free relative to then accommodate a WH question from parts of it. So I'm not sure whether you can make a difference there. Perhaps you can. I haven't thought about it, honestly. But yeah, it's a good question.
Mitchell, did you have any other questions, or shall I give a question to Heather?
Please go on. Yeah, thank you.
So Heather, the floor is yours for your question.
Yeah, I already. Well, I have just a very general question, I guess, to both. But so you primarily focused on ellipses involving fragment answers, which is clausal ellipsis. But I presume that the mechanism you think underlies ellipsis does not only apply to fragment answer. You won't take ellipsis to be a heterogeneous phenomena. So the question is kind of obvious. What's your stand on non-clausal ellipsis and how that works in this respect?
James, you go first.
I go first? Yeah, okay. So I would like the approach to extend to other forms of ellipsis, at least in terms of the structural aspect. So those forms of ellipsis that have been analysed as involving ellipsis-driven movement, I would like to say that that's not the case. So I'm thinking of pseudo-gapping, effectively. Gapping, I don't know, that can be analysed in different ways, but particularly pseudo-gapping with its movement to an internal focus phrase, I would probably, something I'd like to do in the future is go back and see whether you could reanalyse that in a different way. Looking at the literature, I looked at literature a few years back, and I remember seeing some arguments by Bolton, which, yeah, look difficult to overcome, but I'd like to say they should be overcomable. Regarding the licensing condition, I'm actually a believer in there not being a unitary licensing condition on ellipsis. I think that the licensing conditions on clausal ellipsis differ to those on VP ellipsis. Like, so for I think in VP ellipsis, for example, and pseudo-gapping and gapping, you need contrastiveness to be satisfied, whereas you don't necessarily in sluicing. But I think that's not really too relevant to in situ versus non in situ. It's just rather generally more part of my belief system. Yeah, I think that's enough from me. Go ahead, Volker.
Yeah. Likewise, I would love to see that my theory sort of reaches further and extends to other cases, but it may not, because if there was just a bit of discourse and a bit of memory retention to ellipses, then we wouldn't expect to see the language-specific differences that we see. So with regard to VP ellipsis or NP ellipsis, even German and English are not identical. They're fairly different. So there must be more to that. And so I don't think I can extend my theory without finding the additional factors that my theory would need to compensate for the slight overgeneration that's still in it. Whether those would, I don't know what those factors will be, so I cannot comment on that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mitchell, did you want to ask another question?
I think we're probably, I can, but I think we're probably out of time. Is that right?
Okay, all right. All right, let's wrap up then. So first, let me thank our speakers again, James Griffiths and Volker Struckmeier, for a very interesting targeted debate. I want to thank all of you for participating in, well, in this debate, but in the conference in general. Let me just mention that for those of you who still have questions, we have the Discord channel where you can type in your questions. And let me just say that I'll do that because I have some questions left. There is a social hour on GatherTown. And before you guys go there, let me take this opportunity to thank the organizers, the board, because I think they did a wonderful job here organizing this GLOW conference. I really like the concept of the targeted collaborative debates. I also want to thank the technical chairs, the presenters, the participants, the student assistants. Thank you all for a great experience. And we hope to see you all soon, hopefully in person. So have a good evening and see you later.